Okay, so let's start talking about the digestive system. We all do a lot of digesting, so you guys need to be familiar with that, right? Okay, so digestion is where we break down foods into something that the body can use. This can be mechanically, like churning in the stomach, or you actually chewing on your food, or it can be done chemically by some of the enzymes that we're going to talk about. So when we talk about the digestive system, we're talking about a one-way tube, and it's just those things of carrying out those functions that mechanically and chemically digest this material and send it through the tube and absorb the nutrients that we want to absorb and then get rid of the waste. All right. So the system itself is the alimentary canal. This is the one-way tube. And then we have these accessory organs that bring things along. All right. So we have, again, this alimentary canal is the tube itself. And it's about 8 meters long. It's pretty long, guys. And then we have these accessory organs that add things, that add secretions, that allow us to get this food down and allow us to get this food digested. All right, so you can take a look at that and see what these guys do. So you can see how long this alimentary this tube is. I mean, we get into the intestinal tract, we're talking about, feet. We're talking 20 some feet. All right. So first of all, let's take a look at this actual tube. It is a hollow tube, and the wall has 4 layers. It has what's called the inner layer, which is the mucosa, and it's going to have a mucous membrane to allow us to move this stuff along. I mean, we don't want it to be dry. It's going to be folded in some areas to help us increase the surface area so that we can get absorption done, so we can get, churning done. And it will help us absorb these nutrients, and it will secrete mucus, it will secrete enzymes. The submucosa is a connective tissue layer that nourishes those cells. And then we have the muscles that actually help us move this stuff along. Those are smooth muscles. Through most of this, it is 2 layers called the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. In the stomach, we add a 3rd one, an oblique muscle. And then we have the serosa, which is the outermost layer. And basically, that it helps us eliminate friction. It's like we're going over each other. And it is the visceral peritoneum for those organs that sit in the abdominal cavity. So you can see these various layers. When we look at this digestion, we have 2 basic movements. We have a mixing movement and a propelling movement. We're going to have mixing. We swallowed food and we got to mix it. And so we contract rhythmically and try and churn it. All right. We're going to get churning in the stomach, trying to get the hydrochloric acid in contact, those enzymes in contact with that food so it can get it broken up. And then in the small intestine, we're going to segment it into tiny pieces. And then we actually have to propel this stuff along, and we do this by what we call peristalsis. And this is basically a progression of contraction down, kind of sort of like squeezing the toothpaste tube, if you will. Okay? All right. So let's take our little trip down the alimentary canal. First of all, we put the food in the mouth. We chew it. Chewing is mastication. Okay, if you remember the muscle, the masseter muscle, mastication. And this is we are mechanically breaking down this food from the big solid particles into smaller particles. And we are also secreting saliva and mixing the saliva with that food. All right. And that is all done in our lovely oral cavity. We're going to use our tongue. We're going to put it up against the hard palate, which is in the back, right back in the back of the teeth. You can feel the soft palate if you run your finger right in the back. And you're going to roll this food into basically a bolus that we can swallow. So you do have a palate, forms the roof of the cavity and the oral cavity. And again, you have the hard palate, which is directly behind the teeth, and then the softer palate. Okay. This is a huge portal of entry. So we do have a lot of lymphatic tissue. We just got through talking about this. So we do have our palatine tonsils on either side of the tongue. And we have the pharyngeal tonsils, the adenoids. Basically, what we're trying to do is check and see if what we're eating has anything in it, okay, that might be an invader. All right, so you can see that. All right, we're going to mix our food with saliva. It's going to moisten it. It's going to help us dissolve this food. It contains enzymes. This begins the digestion of carbohydrates, particularly your simple sugars. This is why if you need energy, you put the sugar in your mouth, you kind of suck on it, man, you're ready to go, because this is almost completely digested to where you could use it. There are also bicarbonate ions. It keeps that pH where we need it to be and protects the teeth from a lot of the acidic food that we eat. We have 3 pairs. We have the parotid glands, which are right here in front of the ears. These are the ones that swell up when you get mumps, just FYI. This is the largest one. It secretes what we call salivary amylase, okay? And that is what helps in that digestion of those carbohydrates, okay? And then we have the submandibular under the mandible and sublingual under the tongue, and that really does help us with that. So when we take a look at this, we have 2 types of cells. We have serous cells that produce this watery fluid that contain the salivary amylase, again, splitting the sugars into disaccharides. Those 2 simple sugars together makes it very easy for us to digest this food. And then we have the mucus, which helps lubricate this food in getting it down our throat. Okay, so you can see where these are. The pharynx, we have 3 different pieces to this. The nasopharynx directly in back of the nose, the oropharynx in the throat, right here at the back of the throat, and then the laryngopharynx leading into the larynx. And that's just where the placement is, and that's the way they call it. And so we take the food, we put it in our mouth, we swallow it, and it goes into the esophagus. Now, swallowing actually is a pretty interesting reflex. The swallowing is called deglutition. And the first stage is voluntary. You choose to swallow your food. And this is the chewing of it and mixing that food with that saliva and making it into a bolus, rolling it on your tongue up against the hard palate and getting it into a bolus that we can swallow. Now, once we start into the second phase, once we begin to swallow, then we move into involuntary, okay? So the food reaches the oropharynx. As we make that swallowing mechanism, everything now, basically, we don't have to think about it. It's taken over with a involuntary reflex. So bottom line, what happens is the epiglottis is going to close off the top of the larynx so that we don't get food down the trachea. The esophagus lays directly behind the trachea. So you can feel your trachea. The tube directly behind it is your esophagus. So we've got to close off. All of us have choked by, we got the food down the wrong pipe. We've all said that, I'm sure. And that's when we're trying to take in air and swallow at the same time, and that epiglottis doesn't flap over and close it off, okay? And we begin to swallow. So you can go through this process, but you can see that epiglottis, when that bolus of food hits it, it should flap over and protect that larynx so that you do not get food down that trachea. Okay? The epiglottis is just a passageway. I'm sorry. The esophagus is just a passageway from the pharynx to the stomach. It goes through the diaphragm, through what we call the esophageal hiatus. And if you've ever had a hiatal hernia, we'll talk about that. This is where a hiatal hernia forms. It does have mucus glands, moisten this. We want to get this food down very easily. It's partly skeletal muscle, partly smooth muscle. So we got to move this down. You really have to get this food down into the stomach, and sometimes it can get a little caught and that sort of thing. Now, going down into the stomach, you have a sphincter there, which is called the lower esophageal sphincter or cardiac sphincter. We're reaching here right there at the first part of the stomach where the esophagus goes in. Where the esophagus goes into the stomach is called the cardia because it is closest to the heart. And that sphincter is going to regulate food going into the stomach and hopefully closes enough to prevent regurgitation. And again, hiatal hernia, this is where we run into a problem. So we're coming down here with the food. So when we reach the stomach, this is basically below the diaphragm. We have gone down through the diaphragm and into the abdominal cavity. We have 4 sections. We have the cardia, we have the fundus, we have the body, we have the pylorus, okay? What the stomach does, first of all, is obviously gets the food from the esophagus. It's going to mix it with gastric juice. It's going to start protein digestion. This is where we're gonna have pepsin secreted, and we're going to start protein digestion. We don't do a lot of absorption. This is not where we're absorbing. We just swallowed potato chips, broccoli, kale, all that high roughage stuff and meat and stuff like that. And all we've done is chewed it up a little bit and swallowed it. So we can't do much absorption at this point. What the stomach is going to do is get this mixed up, churn it around, get it exposed to this hydrochloric acid, to this gastric juice, and begin to break this down so that we actually can work with it, okay? Again, we do add this third layer of smooth muscle to help with this churning and get us through this. So you can see here's the cardia. This is that sphincter coming in. This is the fundus. Anytime you have a dome like that, it's called a fundus. So when we get to the ovaries, there's a dome on not the ovaries, the uterus. You get a dome, and it's called the fundus. So you have a fundus in the uterus. You can look at these lovely gastric folds, these rugae. All right, I want to point out that you've got this big curvature here and this smaller curvature here. This is the greater curvature of the stomach. This is the lesser curvature of the stomach. These have this mesentery attached to them, this thin, filmy connective tissue, and it's called omentum. And this basically, you have greater omentum and lesser omentum. So this greater omentum is attached to the greater curvature, and the lesser omentum is attached to the lesser curvature. So we have the cardia, we have the fundus, we have the body of the stomach, and then we make this little turn up, and this is called the pylorus. And then we end here at the pyloric sphincter. And once we go past the pyloric sphincter, we are going into the duodenum, which is the first portion of the small intestines. Okay? All right. So the fundus basically is a temporary food storage, sometimes contains swallowed air. You're going to burp it up. Yeah, that sort of thing. But the body is where we really do the main portion. But what's happening here is the stomach becomes a holding tank. We'll talk about that. You can see all these gastric secretions that are going to occur, and it's going to take that food and it's going to mix it with these gastric secretions, and then it's going to hold this substance that we're going to call chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, until the duodenum can take it. The duodenum is going to mix more enzymes in it, and then we're going to slowly move it through the intestinal tract. You can't just dump everything. If you ate a big turkey dinner for Thanksgiving or a holiday dinner or whatever, you had a big meal, you can't just dump all the contents of your stomach straight into the intestinal tract. It has to go in small, discrete pieces, about 3 mLs at a time. Okay, so that the intestinal tract can deal with that. So when we have the gastric juice, you can see these different components. Pepsinogen, which is an inactive form of pepsin, and is secreted by chief cells. These are cells within the wall of the stomach, and pepsin breaks down proteins, down into polypeptides. So this is where we begin protein digestion. We also have what's called gastric lipase. Lipase, we break down fats. Okay, so we begin that process of splitting fats up. We produce a lot of hydrochloric acid. This is about a pH of 1.5 to 2, and it's produced by the parietal cells in that stomach, and that acid helps to convert pepsinogen into pepsin. We're going to have an alkaline mucus that is secreted by the mucus cells. It protects the lining of that stomach from being the cells underneath. You've got that nice alkaline mucus so that the acid just doesn't totally destroy the stomach cells itself. Another important factor that is made in the stomach is intrinsic factor. This is produced by what we call the parietal cells, and this is absolutely necessary for the absorption of vitamin B12. Okay, so you can look at that lining and you can see here's what we call these gastric pits, and you can see these parietal cells and these chief cells within these. And so the fluid, these different things get secreted. The enzymes, the pepsin gets secreted up into here, and you've got a lot of surface area for these to work in. All right, so here's the thing. We have to regulate the secretion of this, and we use what's called a gut brain. We have our sympathetic and parasympathetic impulses, and we've already learned from AP1 that parasympathetic rest and digest. So parasympathetic increases the gastric activity and will stimulate gastric secretion, whereas sympathetic will turn it off. If you're running from the bear, you don't need to be digesting food. And this is why if you are in one of those situations, you may vomit because your stomach is turned off. Okay, just FYI. There is hormonal regulation, and we've got gastrin. We'll talk about that, but gastrin has to do with the mobility of the stomach itself, how much it churns. This mobility of moving the stomach, and gastrin increases the gastric juice secretion and increases the mobility of that and the motility, and just basically you're moving it around, okay? Somatostatin, we talked about with sugar a little bit, but it does inhibit the hydrochloric acid secretion. Cholecystokinin, CCK, anytime you see cholecyst, think of gallbladder, okay? If you have your gallbladder out, it's a cholecystectomy. So cholecystokinin is going to help us with moving the bile, which we're going to need for fat digestion, into that area, into the small intestine. So we're going to talk about that. It actually decreases gastric mobility. So what happens is you're going to churn, and then you're going to kind of cease. And what happens is you're churning, and as you begin to move the chyme from the stomach into the duodenum, you're ready to turn the stomach off. And so the gastrin is going to turn it on, and the cholecystokinin, the CCK, is going to turn it off. It's like, okay, we've done enough churning. We just need to sit here until we can get this stuff moved into the duodenum. Okay? And that's kind of the way it works. You do have 3 phases. Most of us that have a dog are real familiar with the cephalic phase. You know, it's you see food, you smell food, you think about food, you taste food. The dog, it sees food, the drool just starts, okay? Same thing. So you see food, basically, you smell food, you know you're going to eat. The gastric juice is going to start to be secreted. We're going to get ready for that food. The gastric phase is when the food actually reaches the stomach, and you're going to mechanically churn this food. You're going to secrete the chemicals that are needed for that to occur. And then as the food enters the small intestine, we need to turn on the intestines, okay, and begin to turn off the stomach, because once we move it out, we don't want to continue to secrete gastric juice. So this basically tells the body where this food is at any one time. All right, so we want to start, you know, there's no use churning and digesting this stuff unless we're going to absorb it. In terms of absorption in the stomach, again, pepsin begins to break down the proteins, but the stomach doesn't do a good job in terms of absorbing. There's a little bit of water, there's, you know, some alcohol, I've been drinking, but really what we're doing, the most of the absorption is going to occur in the jejunum, okay? All right, so the mixing of the food, you get this paste, it's called chyme, and it's going to be pushed to the pylorus, and again, a small amount of chyme is transported through that sphincter at a time, about 3 cc's. And that, hopefully that lower esophageal sphincter will prevent the backflow into the esophagus. This is a problem that we have with people over 40. You know, we get that hiatal hernia where part of that stomach gets above that diaphragm, and we may get reflux, and that's what that problem is. As the chyme basically enters the duodenum, we bring in a whole bunch of other things that help us with this digestion and absorption. Okay, so when the chyme starts to fill the duodenum, The receptors initiate this enterogastric reflex, and this stops the stomach emptying. And it just basically, so we get little pieces in it at a time. Okay, so we don't overflow the poor little duodenum. And the reason for that is because we've done very little absorption. And that's because we're still not ready at this point in time, to do a whole lot of absorption. We've got it into a paste, but we haven't broken down into the smaller components that we think of that we can start to digest, absorb the food. One of the most important organs, you don't think about it, I mentioned this when we got to the endocrine system, but one of the most important organs in terms of helping us with this digestion is the pancreas. We all think about pancreas with insulin. 99% of the pancreas is digestive. Its job is to produce digestive enzymes, and it produces these enzymes that will break down any of the food that we can actually digest. Okay, so that is the pancreas's exocrine function, is to make this pancreatic juice. And so we have these cells that make up most of that and release that pancreatic juice into two different ducts that will help to get this going. The pancreatic duct, along with the common bile duct, empties into duodenum, and so we get the bile to get to emulsify the fats, take care of the fats, and then you have all the rest of the pancreatic juice. And you can see this gallbladder, and there's that bile duct, that cystic duct coming down and dumping right in here. So you have these two basic ducts that come in. So we can, and it's very early, just coming into the duodenum, and it's very early so that we can get this pancreatic juice to start working on this food. So let's look at this pancreatic juice. First of all, note that we're going, at this point in time, change the pH over to alkaline. These enzymes work better in an alkaline environment, okay? Pancreatic amylase. Basically the same thing as salivary amylase. So we didn't finish it all. I mean, if you sit there, we put the food in our mouth, chew it up, and swallow it. Doesn't take, we can't absorb too much when we do it like that. So we do need amylase to break down the starches. We need pancreatic lipase. Again, we are working with the lipids. Trypsin, proteins. We're going to start to work on help finish those proteins. Chymotrypsin. This is proteins again. Anytime you see trypsin, this is a protein. Carboxypeptidase. Carbohydrates, peptidase, proteins, but these are glycoproteins, so it helps us digest those. Nucleases to digest the RNA, the DNA. And again, we need this bicarb to make the pancreatic juice alkaline. It buffers out the stomach acid, and these particular enzymes work better not in an acid environment. Okay? So how we regulate this, we do this again by hormones. We've talked about CCK, but we also have secretin, which stimulates the pancreas to release that juice. Okay? And again, basically, we've got these impulses that are going to stimulate the pancreas to start secreting these digestive enzymes, because we now know we've got food in the stomach. We're going to get food. All right. Couple of accessory organs are the liver and the gallbladder. Liver, this is our largest organ. It is a blood reservoir. It is a blood filter. There are 4 lobes to it. The main thing here with the liver in terms of the digestive system is that everything that gets pulled out of the intestinal tract goes over to the liver. Okay? And you have a hepatic portal vein that brings that absorbed nutrients to the sinusoids of the liver, which are channels, plates, so that, and in those plates, we do have macrophages that are looking at the food to see whether we've gotten something bad in, okay? And we want to know right away if there's something that's not good coming into the liver. And so you can see that, but huge liver. The liver does, again, we've talked about it with a little bit in the endocrine system, but it produces glycogen. Glycogen, again, is the storage molecule for glucose for animals. And it's kind of like a starburst, and you have these little pieces coming off the starburst. These are little pieces of glucose. So you need sugar, you break one off, you break one off, you break one off. All right, so this glycogen the liver has the ability to make glycogen from the glucose, has the ability to take glycogen and break it down into glucose. It has the ability to convert non-carbohydrates to glucose. So lipids, proteins. It can synthesize your lipoproteins. It can phospholipids, cholesterol. It deaminates it. It breaks up proteins into these amino acids. It can form urea. It can break down heme. The liver is just a huge plant here. It synthesizes plasma proteins. It stores the vitamins. It phagocytizes anything coming in from the gut. It removes toxins. It removes alcohol. It removes drugs. Again, it's a blood reservoir. It makes bile. We're in deep trouble without our liver. Let's face it. Okay? One of the things that it does make is bile. And this is a breakdown product from heme. It does contain bilirubin and biliverdin because we broke the hemoglobin down. The bile salts are produced from cholesterol. And what it does is allow us to emulsify the fats. Okay? Kind of surround those particles and allow us for digestion. Bile, if we get too much of it, there's an indication there is a problem with the liver. If we are breaking down too many red cells or there is a blockage, you may get jaundice, which is a yellowing of the skin and the eyes. And basically this is a buildup of bilirubin. Okay. Can't go past here without mentioning hepatitis, which is inflammation of the liver. This is, there are many different types, but the most common are these viruses. Some are bloodborne pathogens, hepatitis C, hepatitis B. These are well-known bloodborne pathogens. Some of them have an oral fecal transmission, like hepatitis A. Antibiotics are not very good on them. The most 3 common ones that you guys probably are maybe familiar with is hepatitis A. And this is, again, from contaminated feces, some contaminated seawater, that kind of thing. You can get hepatitis from like oysters and shellfish and that kind of stuff. Hepatitis B is this bloodborne. You may be familiar with this. We really look at this in a blood bank. Hepatitis C, again, this is half of the known cases now of hepatitis. Luckily, with hepatitis C now, we do have a treatment. We didn't used to, but we now have a treatment for this. So this is good news. All right, the gallbladder. On the inferior surface of the liver, there is a duct that merges with what we call the common hepatic duct to form the common bile duct. The gallbladder's job is to store bile and concentrate it. This is why you can get gallstones, okay? But you release this bile into the duodenum via the bile duct, and there's a sphincter that regulates that release. So the gallbladder will normally concentrate this stuff. Sometimes the cholesterol forms these crystals, and you can get gallstones, and you may have to have a cholecystectomy, okay? And you'll know it if you have to have it. But you can still eat fats without the gallbladder because you still got a liver. But the gallbladder really does help to concentrate that. And you can see this lovely picture of an unfortunate individual with these lovely gallstones. So the function of the bile salt is to emulsify the fats. You break up these fats into smaller droplets, and basically that allows us to be able to carry a lot of these in the lacteals. We'll talk about that. But this aids in the digestion by increasing the surface area that is accessible to the lipase, which is going to break these lipids up. Okay. They also help us absorb these fat-soluble vitamins, and so important. So you can see this list of hormones, fairly extensive in the digestive tract. You wouldn't think about it. All right, so now we move into the small intestine, and that's most of the abdominal cavity. In fact, if you look at it, in the top of your abdominal cavity is going to be mainly jejunum. You have three sections: the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum. The duodenum isn't that long. Most of that small intestine is jejunum, okay? And the job is to get this chyme from the stomach, and you have the bile and you have the pancreatic secretions come in, and basically what you're doing is you're completing digestion, okay? You have to complete the digestion. Then you're going to, at the same time, but you need to start absorbing these nutrients. The jejunum is going to do most of the absorption. And then once you've done that, you got to get rid of the waste products. Okay? So the duodenum is short. It is the most fixed. It doesn't move too much because it just goes right down the side. And again, this is where we're coming in. The duodenum is where we're bringing in the bile. We're bringing in the pancreatic juices, and we're getting that final mix of stuff that we need for digestion. Okay, the jejunum is the middle portion. It is a thicker portion. It's very active. And then the ileum is the last portion before we go into our large intestine. The ileum contains what we call Peyer's patches, which lymph nodules. We're going to look at this food again, okay? All right, so the jejunum and the ileum are suspended by this material that we call mesentery, and if you hold up the intestinal tract, you can see it's a film, and you can see all the blood vessels running through it, okay? And it's basically allows a little structure for these blood vessels so that we can get these nutrients back over to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. And again, so if you open up an animal, you'll see this drape, and that is the greater omentum. And again, it's attached to the greater curvature of that stomach. And it kind of drapes over, keeps these organs moist and contained. Okay, so you can see this mesentery. And you can see the duodenum, and then we have lots and lots and lots and lots of jejunum, and then we finally make it into the ileum. Notice the spelling on the ileum. I-L-E-U-M. Just FYI. Okay, so when we get to the small intestine, we're talking about, now we have these projections called the villi, and they allow us to increase the surface area of this intestinal tract. It allows us to do this absorption. And each one of these little villi contain simple columnar epithelium. That's what you looked at in AP1. All right, and you have blood vessels, which are going to absorb the nutrients, and then you have a lacteal that is a lymphatic capillary that's going to absorb the fat, and so that everything can basically get absorbed. So you've got little folds in there that basically increase that surface area, but you can see there's your vascular system and there's your lymphatic system. So everything is there, so you can just move this stuff, absorb it in, and get it out. Okay? And you can see those little villi, those little structures that make it much easier to absorb. So the kinds of things that the small intestine secretes, again, a mucus. By the goblet cells, we need a thick alkaline mucus. We're going to have some water. It's going to pick up these digestive products and transport it into the villi. It doesn't have digestive enzymes. But then we have some more enzymes that are going to be secreted. Again, peptidases to break down proteins, things to break down disaccharides into monosaccharides, sucrase to break down sucrose, maltase to break down maltose, lactase to break down lactose. And then we have, again, a lipase to help finish the fats. So the regulation of this, basically the contact of the chyme stimulates these goblet cells to secrete the mucus, and you get distension of this intestinal wall, activates the nerves, and we're going to start to do this absorption. Now, basically, there are different ways that you can absorb this, but your amylase will break down these sugars, these carbohydrates, into disaccharides, and then the intestinal enzymes will break these disaccharides into monosaccharides, and then basically we're going to actively transport or do by facilitated diffusion into the bloodstream. We're going to help it along. Facilitate it. It's diffusion. You don't need energy. It's going to be helped along. The proteins, you can see these proteases are going to start to break down. The pepsin's going to start in the stomach. We're getting it into the intestine. And then we're going to absorb those by active transport. We don't want to lose amino acids. The fats are going to be emulsified. They're going to be digested. If you've ever seen a fat, there's a glycerol and then 3 fatty acids that come off of it, and it's digested into that. And then they are absorbed into the lymphatic vessels. Basically, what happens is these fatty acids and bile salts, the fatty acids are synthesized, as it says, into triglycerides in the smoothie R, and these new triglycerides cluster, and they form what are called a chylomicron, and the chylomicrons are how they are absorbed into the lacteals, and you can see these little chylomicrons moving in there. This is a really nice picture, so go through it and take a look at it, but you can see they're broken up and then they're wrapped. And because this is they take the triglycerides and wrap it in the protein so they can move in. Couple of ways to move through here again is the peristalsis, pushing it, or we're going to segment here to get it in discrete packages so we can actually hopefully not overload the duodenum. If the small intestine becomes over distended, you get a rush, and you're going to quickly dump this stuff into the large intestine, which is going to result in diarrhea, which is not fun. All right, so we come down to the end of the small intestine, and we reach what is called the ileosphinctal valve, the ileocecal sphincter, and this is going to regulate the flow into the large intestine. All right, so the large intestine, not too long, as I mentioned, most of the length is in the small intestine, and so we're going to come in. The first part of the large intestine is the cecum. And the distal end, the end is, we're going to exit out through the anus. Really what the large intestine does is absorb water. You've got bacteria in there that are going to basically help you it's going to make vitamins for us. But whether you are constipated, whether you have a normal bowel movement, or whether you have diarrhea, really depends on how long you spend in the large intestine. The longer you spend in the large intestine, the more compacted the feces becomes, okay? So it's going to absorb water, it's going to absorb electrolytes, and form this fecal material. So you have the cecum, that's a little pouch at the beginning. The appendix is off the cecum. We're the only ones with appendixes. Not going to find them in cats, dogs, pigs, and so forth. There are lymph nodules in the appendix. They're not really sure what the appendix is. There is some immune response. They think partly why our appendix is there is to hopefully repopulate bacteria into the large intestine in case they're killed. Then you have the colon. You have the ascending, the transverse, the descending, the sigmoid. Again, we're the only ones with sigmoid colons. You're not going to find them in cats, pigs, dogs, so on. And then you move into the rectum, and then into the anal canal. All right, so you can see this. There's our lovely little ileum coming in. There's our appendix. There's the opening. That's the ileocecal valve or ileocecal sphincter. Ascending because you're going up. There's a flexure there. Transverse going across the belly. And then descending coming down. And then you have this S curve, and that is our sigmoid colon. Again, not found in other animals. All right, so the large intestine, again, 4 layers. It does have bands, these Taenia coli that run down the length. It creates these pouches called haustra. You can see these little pouches. Okay. And which helps form the fecal material into a little more discrete packets. The large intestine, again, almost no digestive function whatsoever. It contains goblet cells. It's going to secrete mucus, but it houses the intestinal flora, several different bacteria, primarily your lactobacillus, your Escherichia coli, E. coli, and these are bacteria that break down the contents such as cellulose. We can't break down cellulose. We don't have that ability. We are not cows, okay? Or some of these, any horse, any animal that eats this cellulose, we can't break it down. Cellulose is to us fiber, and we cannot break it down. But the intestinal flora may produce vitamin K, vitamin B12, thiamine. So these are important vitamins that this flora makes. So basically, we're going to remove that water, and the smell that you smell is a mixture of some of the gases that are caused by these bacteria and that sort of thing. I'm going to pause right here.
And it won't be countdown.
Okay. All right, so I took a break. Sorry. All right, so movements of the large intestine, similar to the small intestine. It is slower, it is less frequent. As you move through the intestinal tract, the peristaltic waves slow down. So you can see the mass movement is 2 to 3 times a day, usually following your meals. There's such a thing as a gastroceliac reflex. There's also that basically what goes in when you put something in the top of the tube, something goes out the back of the tube. All right. So when you swallow something, you're going to have to get rid of the waste at the end of the tube. All right. So you do have a defecation reflex, and that helps us eliminate these feces. Particularly in the older people when it's a little more difficult, getting that deep breath, contracting the abdominal muscles, getting this out becomes a little more difficult. And that's why your older folks, again, the nerve reflexes, a lot of them are going to need stool softeners and that sort of thing. So the fecal material you can see is mainly water, because that's what we've absorbed the water out, but we still got a lot of water left. There is bacteria in there. If you've ever seen it underneath a slide, and I have, it's actually very pretty because we have these bile pigments that provide color, and you have all the crystals from the food stuff, and it's actually very pretty. So changes to the system are slow. Eventually, yeah, the enamel thins, the gums can recede, the GI tract becomes less efficient. This is why your older folks, if you're caring for older folks, if you're nursing and you're caring for older folks, this is why they're going to have problems with constipation. It's just a fact of life here. So nutrient absorption decreases, and incidence of lactose intolerance increases. But yeah, as you get older, you got those issues.